As part of the Clear-Sighted Career Online Learning Series, we welcome you to this webinar titled Strategies for Engaging Millennials in the Workplace. This webinar is for individuals who lead, manage, or work with members of Generation Y or Millennials and are seeking greater understanding and ideas on how to better engage with these individuals. Attracting, developing, and retaining the best of these individuals is critical and a big talent challenge for organizations. We know that a lot is written and said of this generation, and to be clear, we're speaking about individuals born between roughly 1980 and the year 2000. And some of what's been said and written has created some misperceptions and, in fact, stereotypes. Today, with the help of our expert, we will work to course correct any misunderstandings and share specific strategies that individuals in any size organization can implement to increase communication, collaboration, and engagement. So what do we know about this millennial generation? Well, we know they will constitute 50% of the global workforce by the year 2020, and that will rise to 75% by the year 2050. We also know that they'll change jobs an average of every 3 to 5 years as they seek to gain experience and fulfillment in their work. Their career goals, attitudes about work, and the fluency with new technologies in our digital world will absolutely reshape the 21st century workplace. And in fact, that's taking place today. So it's important for us to understand, and fortunately we have an expert in Jessica McManus Warnell through her work in the classroom, the research she's conducted, the book that she has written. My name is Sharon Keane. I serve as Director of Professional and Academic Programs with the Alumni Association, and now I'd like to introduce you to our expert. Jessica McManus Warnell is an Associate Teaching Professor in the Department of Management in the Mendoza College of Business here at the University of Notre Dame. And Jessica joined Mendoza in the year 2000, and as I shared, her teaching experience and research certainly qualify her on this topic. Additionally, Jessica teaches Managing and Millennials and Giving Voice to Values, among other courses, and she teaches these to our undergraduate millennial business students. This past spring, Jessica published her book, Engaging Millennials for Ethical Leadership, What Works for Young Professionals and Their Managers. She conducted the research on which the book is based, so she has the first-hand experience which she'll share with us today. Jessica, I know that too often for you, the popular press wasn't really reconciled lining up with your experience with our students in the classroom, plus the marketplace research that you did, and so you got curious. And so I want to welcome you to Clear-Sighted Career and thank you for today's presentation.
Great. Thank you very much, Sharon. I'm grateful for the chance to be with you and with all of you for joining us today. So our agenda for the session, we're going to start with just a brief snapshot and overview of the generations currently in the workforce today. We'll speak about the millennial generation specifically and start by dispelling some of the stereotypes that Sharon mentioned are prevalent in the media, and again, not really reconciling with what we're seeing in our classrooms and what we're hearing from our recruiters. We'll highlight some research findings from existing research and from some Notre Dame new and emerging research, and then some strategies for success in the workplace. So here's just a brief sketch of the populations in the workplace today, a quick overview, and it's really an exciting time for us in the workplace, also a challenging time. We have 4 generations represented in today's workforce, and there's a bit of quibbling around the edges regarding birth year, but in general we have these 4 groups, the silent generation, the baby boomers, Generation X, of which I'm a proud member, and our millennial groups. And as Sharon noted, these folks are typically born between 1980 and 1995, and they are projected to represent half of our workforce by 2020 and 75% by 2050. So these are our employees, and increasingly they are our managers and our leaders. So our questions were, what are the unique characteristics of this cohort? and how can we leverage those characteristics for success in our organizations. So again, this notion of kind of the way this group is portrayed in the media was really what first caught our attention. And the question was, how is this dynamic playing out in our cultural context? So a first consideration, this topic is all over the newspapers. We took a look at some headlines. We looked at conference topics at academic circles. We have consultants for hire, and then certainly in the popular press, portrayals of this group tend to be negative. We see a lot of reference to words like narcissistic and needy attached to their technical devices. And again, looking at this information and these media portrayals, we were surprised to see this misalignment with what we see here at Notre Dame and then what we hear from folks working with and hiring our alums. So our hope was to reframe the way that this group is approached. And we think a more helpful stance than lamenting kids these days and making kind of generalizations based on birth year is to consider the key experiences that folks are having in their formative years. And we'll talk about that a little bit shortly. The point then is to recognize what shaped people, what make them who they are, and then focusing on aligning these characteristics with the larger goals of our culture, of our society, of our organizations becomes our task. So my framework in teaching and for the book is quite optimistic. Acknowledging that there is some frustration, I think, is key, and we did hear a bit of this in our corporate interviews. We want to validate this experience, but again, noting that this kind of approach is not necessarily productive, and a change of frame can be helpful for all of us as we acknowledge that the motivations of this age group are rooted in the economic and social conditions of their early adulthood and their youth. So we our young people today have come of age post-Enron, post-financial crisis. They've seen things like job loss of parents and friends. It's not surprising that they desire a measure of security and control over their professional lives. And again, we think this points to some net positives for business. We see at the same time among these groups rise of things like social entrepreneurship, B corporations, new models of business, certainly more diversity in our schools and at work. So these are tremendous positives. Another interesting finding that emerged initially was that research suggests that young people of previous generations may have adopted a more oppositional pose with those in leadership positions. Here we might think about the representatives of the baby boomer generation or Generation X. But millennials, and again, this is likely because of their experiences with their parents, teachers, and coaches, seem to be much more willing to work within systems and with more experienced workers to make things better for all in our organizations, which we think is absolutely good news for managers. A broad finding that we saw consistently throughout the research is illustrated by a quote that we have. And this is included in some research that came out of Deloitte. So this quote is from Barry Salzberg, CEO of Deloitte Global. He notes that millennials are just as interested in how a business develops its people and its contribution to society as they are in its products and its profits. And we saw this theme emerge again and again. I should note that the data from this Deloitte Millennial Survey is available online, a very thorough executive summary with lots of tips and insights for managers at organizations in many different contexts. And we'll come back to this research in a bit. This desire for meaningful work, I think, can kind of characterize the generation and, again, speaks to a net positive for us as managers and people who are leading these organizations. So, again, we might ask, who are these folks? A couple of, we think, important characteristics are that the context matters, and we're in this era where we are experiencing the first of the digital natives coming of age. So this is one of the answers to the question, why is this group of young people different than those that came before them? So really think of technology as a multiplier. Everything they do is amplified and shared, and communicated around the world in ways that it has never been before. So this would be, of course, things like media, including social media. We're also in a different context for business, where globalization, interconnectedness, we have this shared context, concerns, these notions of business's impact on the world, things like sustainability. The stakes are quite high, and we can really see this with the advent of big data, the media coverage, and these global connections. The third factor we think is quite relevant is the sheer number. So these folks are children of the baby boomers, and there are right now more than 90 million in this age group in the United States alone. A recent magazine headline reminded us that there are more 23-year-olds than any other age group in the United States. And at the same time, more business degrees are being awarded in the U.S. than any other type of degree. So this points to, I think, a lot of important information for business educators and for managers. We really ignore these dynamics at our own risk. We hoped to identify then key characteristics of the generation. So again, this is described in the academic literature, and it was reflected in our Notre Dame research. So the characteristics of technological and social media fluency, proclivity to multitask, teamwork capacities, a preference for mentorship and training, explicit desire for meaningful work, and awareness of social and environmental sustainability. Our question was whether employers are seeing these dynamics at work. So again, we can think about the Deloitte findings. One interesting finding that was in this study, again, was that millennials express and feel very strongly that businesses should have a positive impact on wider society. They reflect agreement with the idea that the purpose of business is to improve society and to protect the environment. They're more optimistic about general economic conditions, and they very often say their company's purpose is part of the reason they chose to work there. So we do, however, see a gap between their expressed goals and their perspectives of the goals that their managers hold. So we think this, again, is an opportunity. Because of this kind of hyper-connected nature of the group, they kind of cross-fertilize these ideas with one another. We call them super-connected in the language of the Deloitte study, this strong collective social conscience. So again, a task for those in leadership positions in our organizations is to leverage this interconnectedness toward the goals of the organization as a whole. We were very interested, of course, in our research here at Notre Dame. Does that align with what managers are seeing at work? We were very pleased to see the answer is yes. The consistency with the expressed characteristics of this group and how they're perceived by their management was quite high. And we were encouraged by this finding because it does support the idea that generational differences exist and that these can be engaged and channeled toward organizational success. So if we can identify some of the dynamics, we can discern how to best foster and develop them towards shared goals. So this data here is just a bit of indication of agreement between the perception of those characteristics and what managers are seeing. And here this data comes from corporate respondents, a very diverse group of respondents from small to very large professional services organizations representing a variety of industries. And the research, of course, is featured in more detail in the book. A couple of interesting findings, highlights I think are particularly relevant here. One is this difference in expectation around engagement. So while previous generations may have displayed or continue to display reluctance to meet with supervisors or frame being called to the office as negative, millennials actually display a preference for frequent communication. And they are willing and excited about the opportunity to talk with people in positions of leadership in their organizations. And perhaps this is not surprising when we consider the types of interactions they had with parents and coaches and teachers, in their formative years. And, the caveat here for managers is that this need not be excessively burdensome. We're not talking about, hourly meetings every day with your young people on staff. We could think about ways to leverage technology to enhance this communication. To millennials, an email check-in or a post on a discussion board is a form of connection. In the data after data, research suggests that this investment is worth it and pays off with retention and productivity. Again, to continue the theme of kind of technology as a tool, it's this platform that they're used to. It's the water in which they swim, and companies can do all sorts of things with technology, both internally and externally, which perhaps is another topic, but engaging with stakeholders broadly within the organization and outside, sharing mission, connecting around goals. It can be a tool that employers can leverage for engagement across all levels of the organization, again, with email check-ins, discussion boards, and different ways to communicate and reinforce goals, missions, and objectives. We include here just a quick piece specifically about differences related to the way we think about ethics at work. And of course, here at the University of Notre Dame, business ethics is a strong hallmark of our efforts. And so broadly, if our goal is creating effective ethical organizations, we might consider the different ways that generations manifest their values at work. And so this is some data from the Institute of Business Ethics, which indicate to us that there are similarities in what we want from work and what we value from our work life. We see a lot of questions on what people desire. The differences may just come in the ways that they're manifest. So our kind of takeaway here would be that programs at top companies that take the time to name these issues and to call attention to them explicitly, acknowledging generational differences and engaging in discussion around them, these tend to foster best practices, and we'll talk about some examples. So what might be some recommendations? We might want to first acknowledge that many of these approaches can work for organizations of all sizes. The scale of the engagement might change, but the components themselves are the same, and a variety of contexts as well. A couple of best practices that we found were specific to U.S.-based business. And so I'll just highlight a couple. But generally, among the strongest areas of appreciation for this millennial talent is their willingness to work hard when engaged and their commitment to social and environmental issues. Their penchant for seeking purpose and meaning at work is acknowledged and respected by their managers. One of the executives in our study noted that her approach to managing young talent is guided always by explaining the why behind tasks and projects that are requested in order to connect the purpose and the mission of the organization with the activity. And managers across the board in our study consistently reported awareness that higher levels of connectedness with millennials leads to increased productivity and organizational outcomes. The survey out of Notre Dame and the research was supported in part by our Notre Dame Deloitte Center for Ethical Leadership. And the Deloitte Center for Ethical Leadership is housed in the Mendoza College of Business. And so we can start with just a quick reference to some of the efforts at Deloitte themselves. They do produce this very extensive research on millennials, and they conduct this research across many of their organizations throughout the world. And this really can provide some great best practice examples. Really, by engaging the voices of these young people in their company, they contribute to developing these strategies for engaging them. And their findings can drive their internal work and influence their clients. Another example comes out of the global consulting firm McKinsey. They do a dedicated Global Values Day around business ethics and values that involves role-playing and development of action plans for responding to ethical challenges. And importantly, They do this in kind of cross-functional teams with cross-level teams, so folks from different levels in the organization. This is a great approach that will resonate with millennials who would like to work with colleagues across the organization. They want to feel they're involved and connected, and it's really important for them to witness these aspirational role models and their peers engaging around values. Also at McKinsey, they do a session for partners and new managers working together to discuss values examples. They're modeling intergenerational mentoring and connection. Another best practice example we witnessed was out of General Electric, where they specifically engaged in an employee team around integrating millennials into the culture by creating a team made up of these young folks, working on ways to engage with human resources on attracting and developing and retaining millennial talent. And the examples go on and on. I think key takeaway would be that those companies and organizations that explicitly address these issues are doing the best work here. Some kind of conclusions we can draw. One would be acknowledging the perspective of the young people themselves. We did conduct a survey, some reflection writing, and a focus group with the young people, and these are some of our findings. And fortuitously today, in our Notre Dame Observer, we saw an article with a young millennial writing herself about responding to some of these perceptions about her cohort and echoing this idea that young people are quite excited about the opportunities that face them. They're mindful of the challenges that await, but they're optimistic and thoughtful and committed. And this, again, resonates very strongly with what I see at Notre Dame. Millennials themselves, of course, have a place at the table, acknowledging their new responsibilities in this paradigm where connection is key, access and transparency is key, accountability is required. And so, you know, in this context, they're certainly tasked with managing their presence and performance deliberately and consistently. And then again, all of us can start from the place that we are all shaped by our experiences, and that explicit and engaging attention to these issues really does work to make the workplace a better place for all of us. Brief mention, and I won't go into detail, but the slide is here for your reference, a study out of PricewaterhouseCoopers that emerged from their research with global CEOs is quite interesting, and they were engaging around the question of employee retention, and one of their data sets pointed them to some research related to the perennial top of the most desired company to work for, which is Google. You know, what are they doing right to engage and retain young people? And I think a key from this list of findings is treating employees as important as their customers, and various ways that they engage employees at all levels of the organization, which has been particularly attractive to young talent and aligns very nicely with some of our findings. The only note I would mention here is I would extend Eric Schmidt's comment, nothing is more important than the quality of hiring to include talent management and employee engagement. For leaders in our organizations putting it all together, we've identified some strategies for success, and they're listed here for us, again, with the broad notion of galvanizing our workforces around purpose broadly and explicitly, creating connections, communicating frequently, acknowledging this penchant for impact and meaning, thinking about measurement and accountability, and then engaging around cross-level connections. So this would be providing examples of aspirational role models. We try to do this at Notre Dame with the connections that we make with business. Incorporating mentorship within the company, so this can take the form of leader-led, peer-to-peer, or reverse mentoring, again, to create organizations that are not just valuable and meaningful for millennials, but for all in our organizations. Here's just a quick reference to the book. Again, about our methodology, we talked to executives themselves and to a number of our students and tried to relay the experiences and perceptions of both groups in ways that can provide meaningful feedback and action items for both the millennials and their managers. Happy to talk further about any of the topics addressed today. So thank you very much for your time. I'll turn it to Sharon.
Thank you, Jessica, very much for stepping us through and helping us understand some of the stereotypes and misperceptions, reminding us that we're all shaped by experience. So this generation, millennials, is no different than other generations in that. So you also moved us through the research and some specific strategies. So I'm going to take us back to that notion of meaningful work. One of the things that this generation is known for, really valuing purpose. To me, that's good news in that it leads to higher engagement, productivity, contributions that these individuals will make, and overall sense of fulfillment. That's great news. And how do we temper that with the data that many individuals in this generation will move on, make career changes every 3 to 5 years? How do we manage our talent in this way?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think what I would say to that is, again, to emphasize this, this theme of connectedness and engagement. So explicitly trying to create the conditions under which connection is possible. So events, activities, some of these kind of group ethics engagement activities. So making this explicit at work. A broad idea also would be, I think sometimes the perception here is that, you know, if every need or whim is not met at work, then you'll see a lack of loyalty and retention. And I think what we're really seeing the data suggest is that if organizations can connect the activities that they're asking their young hires to do to the larger mission, and again explain the why behind the what, I think that that will go a long way toward creating success and retention. And again, I was really struck by that comment from the PwC research that we should think about, you know, treating our employees as important as we do our customers.
Right. Not a new principle.
Absolutely not.
But a good reminder on that front.
Yeah.
So as you were sharing with us some of the research, and again going back to meaning and purpose, it seems that this generation, the numbers that are coming into the workforce globally, that they obviously are reshaping organizations. Might they redefine organizational success more towards that triple bottom line of tending to people, to planet, and to profit?
Great. Yeah. In our classes, we take a look at some of the corporate reporting that's happening these days, and even these long-standing, long-term successful companies in our context are really being called to have some level of accountability along this triple bottom line. So just not financial metrics, but success around social issues. This would be treatment of labor force. This would be interactions with local communities. Then we can think about environmental aspects. So where are materials sourced? What is our, what is our environmental footprint? And again, because these young folks seem to be expressing awareness of these issues and the necessity of them, and involvement with some pretty specific causes and engagements, we think that the employers can leverage this interest and this knowledge and their networks in ways that can align what's happening in the world with what the company's core competencies are and really make a contribution across the triple bottom line.
Maybe there's a research project and or a book in there somewhere, I don't know, but yeah, perhaps. You had mentioned about this notion of regular feedback, not in a burdensome way, but consistently having managers, leaders engage with their millennial colleagues. And part of the reason behind that that desire for feedback is accountability to self, correct?
Absolutely.
Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think, and again, it's, I think, directly related to the formative experiences young people have had. But think about the way that, I see it in my classroom all the time, the way that they manage their time and their attention And I think part of it is kind of the systematic attempt to see what works and ways that we can connect people and think about connection in broad ways, not restrict ourselves to this traditional notion of a staff meeting, once a month that will reflect our engagement. I'm reminded of one of our student respondents who is a senior level business student who had an internship with a high-profile firm over a summer, and talked about how his task was to read the environment he was in and find the way for the most effective communication to take place. So he talked about repeatedly sending emails to his direct supervisor with questions. And after about a week of this, the supervisor walked down the hall and knocked on the door and said, "I'm right here. Anytime you want to see me, pop your head in." And the student said as soon as he was given that direction about the preferred mode of communication, he felt much more confident doing it. And he found that these quick interactions with his supervisor were mutually satisfying. He felt engaged, and he was much more enthusiastic about being productive and committed.
So it seems like almost given permission, and that was the preference, that it's okay for you to approach me. In fact, that would be wonderful and desired.
Exactly.
And so with that,
the door opens.
Exactly.
Yes.
So we're optimistic. We have reason to be rooted in research, and I also want to challenge us to drill it down to really practical, because I'm sure there are some folks who are somewhat frustrated or struggling with how do I communicate and collaborate with my colleagues in this generation. What are one or two takeaways, real practical strategies, takeaways that someone could employ?
Sure. I think this is something that could happen in a larger, small group, but I really believe in the power of naming a dynamic. So acknowledging, that there may be communication differences happening here, and why don't we get together and talk about them a little bit and really put it on the table. I was so encouraged to learn from one of my graduating students last year who works for a large company that they asked her to do a presentation on generational differences and some of the findings she had uncovered here at Notre Dame and in her own time. And she was just astonished by the goodwill at this meeting and kind of the connections that were forged. So I think, again, kind of being explicit about creating a space for these conversations to happen. And I think I'd return also for a second point to this notion of connecting to the why. A lot of research suggests that if you look at organizations, there is a lack of awareness at different levels about organizational mission, values, goals, and those are very powerful elements of an organization, and inculcating them throughout the organization needs to be explicit. It's not enough just to have a mission statement on your door. People have to engage around it, talk about it. What does it mean? What are examples? And hearing senior folks talk about how they have lived that mission in their work lives can be very powerful for the young people themselves and validating, I think, for the leaders.
That's great. Just to build on what you said, and you mentioned this in your presentation, this notion of mentoring, again, not a new concept, but I love that you've incorporated not only the traditional, what we might think of the traditional mentoring, the experienced person being the mentor, the less experienced being the mentee, you're recommending that, but you're also talking about peer-to-peer mentoring.
Sure.
And the power in that, and then the reverse mentoring. Could you just touch on or tell us a brief description of reverse mentoring and how that might work?
Sure, that's great. And it's perhaps, again, something that's been happening for a long time, but it's happening much more, and people are naming it at this point. And it's really, I think, easy to do and empowering to both of the groups involved. So an example would be to engage a new hire, a younger employee with a more experienced colleague around something where the young person might have a competency. So this, an easy example here might be something technologically related. So we were surprised, for example, when we asked questions about social media policy and social media use, which is increasingly a concern by managers. quite many of our companies did not have an explicit policy. So really engaging with the young people who are using these technologies and have the fluency and understanding of how they work can help advise the teams who are shaping the policies and put in place robust strategies. So in that way, the young people are teaching and the more experienced colleagues are learning together.
It seems like a virtuous cycle. Everybody
Absolutely.
wins. So, well, Jessica, thank you again for participating in the Clear-Sighted Career Online Learning Series and giving us the benefit of your research, your experience, and insights into what we can do practically and strategically as we look to engage with millennials in the workplace. So thank you very much.
Thank you.